Ah, the humble bathtub, an often overlooked piece of Terraria furniture, but it absolutely shouldn't be because it's one of the most versatile pieces of decoration in the game. In this video, I'm going to show you some of the many ways in which you can utilize bathtubs in your Terraria builds, and then I'm going to use a random number generator to pick a bathtub at random for me to then base an entire build around, just to prove how truly versatile the bathtub is. So first up we have the mahogany bathtub, perhaps one of the best in the game. As you can see, it looks like a giant wooden bowl, which means it can be used as such in a manner of ways. Here is one example where I used it as a paint mixing bowl for my painter NPC house. So all I did here was just place some coloured waterfall blocks flowing into it, and I used it as the centerpiece, the mixing bowl, and as you can see, it conveys that concept pretty well. It can also be used as a dye vat. As you can see here in my dye trader NPC house, all I did was just paint the top of it different colours to make it look like the dye was overflowing from the vat and spilling down the sides, and then add some painted banners and painted walls on top to convey the idea that the fabric was being dipped into the vats to dye it. Next is a rather obscure use, but you can indeed use the mahogany bathtub as a tiny little boat slash raft. So I used it in this way in my pirate NPC house Shipwreck Cove build. Here we are, you can see it there. So all you need to do for this is just place some echo painted platforms just underneath the surface of the water, and then place the bathtub on top. And then you can add in some further detail by using either fences for a mast, or you can use sails with the mast, or you can just have it plain. It looks fine either way. And next up we have the ebonwood bathtub. Again, a very versatile bathtub, mainly because it looks like a large barrel, so it's a natural fit in things like wine cellars, as I've demonstrated here in this quick mock-up build. And you can see they look exactly like the kind of barrels that people use to ferment wine in, ferment the grapes to make wine. But you can also use them as a flotation device, so I'll demonstrate that here by building a very simple raft. So all you need to do is just place some echo coated platforms underneath the water, then the bathtub on top. Then you can build your raft on top of the barrels to make it look like they're attached and they're the thing that's causing it to float. So I'll show you an example of how I actually used this in one of my builds before. And here we have the Dryad NPC house. So I needed this little platform area here to be floating on the water. So the place where I've placed the pylon. So I used the ebony bathtub to convey this idea. Now, those two bathtubs that we've just discussed are by far the most versatile, but even some of the more niche bathtubs also have pretty fantastic uses in building. So take, for example, the wreath bathtub. It looks great as a giant shell, either on the beach or in the ocean. And here's an example of how I used it in my angler NPC house build. So it's really good at just filling in some empty space in beach builds. And now glass bathtubs. Now the argument could be made that they can be used for windows. They are certainly quite unique as windows. You can't really recreate this with anything else. But in my opinion, they just look a little bit strange, and I think there are much better options in terms of windows. And ashwood bathtubs, well, let's be honest, this is just a giant bird nest. So we can use these to spruce up any living wood trees in our world. But we can also add a little more detail by placing a silly balloon wall painted white just above the nest. And now you have an egg in your nest. And we can take this one step further by placing some living leaf walls behind, adding a little eye and a little beak. And now look at that, our egg has hatched and we have a baby chick in our little nest. Now of course the baby chick here looks pretty derpy. I mean, I'm sure if I spent a little bit more time on this, I could have a pretty realistic chick. And next we have the flesh bathtub, which looks like a stone sarcophagus smeared with blood, at least to me. So this means it naturally fits with builds like butchers' shops, execution areas, torture chambers, and of course graveyards. So I threw together this quick graveyard here to demonstrate, but to be honest, I think pearlwood bathtubs fit more with this kind of graveyard design because it's outdoor, and most coffins outdoor are made of wood, not stone. But the flesh bathtub does really fit in with graveyard areas that have a crypt, because usually in crypts the coffins are made of stone and are a lot more decorative. So here's an example of how I used it in one of my crypts in one of my graveyard builds. And next we have the lizard bathtub. It's obviously a natural fit in any sort of jungle build that uses the jungle temple aesthetic. They can be used for walls, fences, tower crenellations, pretty much anything to do with golem or any sort of jungle temple build. Next up, the dynasty bathtub. So this reminds me a lot of a Japanese Shinto shrine. So here's an example of one being used as a Shinto shrine. But to be honest, you can pretty much use this as detail in quite a lot of Asian builds. And next we have the Legion bathtub. So to me this looks a lot like a fossil because it's got the little bony bits sticking out. Kind of reminds me of like a spine or something like that. So this can be used in things like archaeology camps or underground desert builds. And the obsidian bathtub is great in hell builds. Here I've used it as the crenellations of a small hellfire tower, but it can also be used for things like evil shrines. It just has that twisted evil aesthetic, so it's pretty much good for anything built in the underworld. So now that I've shown you a few examples of how to use bathtubs in different ways, now it's time for me to prove that you can utilize any bathtub and you can design an entire build around it, or at least just use it in a build where it makes sense. So here you can see I've made a list of all the bathtubs in the game and I've given them a number, and now I'm going to use a random number generator to pick one at random, and then I'm going to design a build around it. So let's get straight to it. So it appears that we got the bone bathtub. So without further ado, let's begin. And for the idea that I have in mind, I am going to want the purple colours of the corruption. So I built up this little tower made of wood, and now I'm going to place the bone bathtub on top, and this is going to be the centerpiece for this build. And now I'm using the bone wand to place bones to create a tower-like structure, just working my way down from the bathtub on top. And another quick tip, just whilst I'm building this, to make you a little better at building, it's worthwhile creating lore or little stories for your builds whilst you're building them or before you're building them. At least it really helps me in the design process. So for example, for this build, I came up with this little story. So this area was the site in which a great battle took place. The corpses were too numerous to be buried, so they were just piled on top of each other in a big huge heap and left to rot in the sun, and so they were nothing more than bones. But the pain and anguish of all the dead soldiers trapped their souls in the heap of bones, and this bone heap developed into its own entity, comprised of bones and tortured, anguished souls. So the bone heap only desires to grow to spread more misery and corruption in the world, and it can use the souls of the dead inside it to animate the skeletons within to attack and kill anything that comes close. And when it kills something, it can then absorb that thing's soul and also reanimate that thing's body. So I call this one the Accursed Bone Heap. Now this little story that I created may seem kind of strange to people, but for me it's given me loads of ideas and loads of inspiration about how I want this build to look and the kind of things I want to include in it. And you can see here we have gotten ourselves a little pet eater of souls from destroying a tree. Now usually this would be killing me, but because I'm in journey mode it can't, so it's just going to float around us. So here I'm just placing some bone walls, and then I'm going to add in some demon campfires, and then some bone platforms for texture. And then I'm going to add in some Souls of Night inside echo-coated item frames, and these are the things that are going to act as these tortured souls that are trapped in the bone heap. And now I'm actually going to use the rubble maker. So I've never really fiddled around with this thing before. I haven't used it in any previous builds, but because there are so many bone themed background sprites, I simply have to use it for this. And I've painted some background walls black just to add a bit of depth. And now I'm going to add in some posts on either side, just because I feel like it needs something on the sides. It's too much empty space. And in the story that I came up with for this build, the bone heap can reanimate the skeletons that it consists of, and these skeletons will attack people in order to grow the bone heap. And we can easily create that in Terraria simply with some skeleton statues and timers painted with echo coating. So I'm just going to put those in now, and then when we activate the timers, voila, our accursed bone heap now summons skeletons from itself. And this can be used as a hazard or something similar in an adventure map or adventure world. But remember, this idea all came from a simple bathtub. So I really hope I've shown you some of the many great possibilities with bathtubs in Terraria, and I hope I've inspired you to utilize bathtubs a little bit more in your own builds. And if you liked the vid, please like, comment and subscribe. Now, go forth and place your bathtubs.